So, this is an issue that I knew about prior to, you know, all of the work that we did to the truck, that the brakes are horribly warped. Well, now that the truck goes faster, they're even more warped. Because I don't know if you know this, but when you warp brakes, after they're already warped, when you get them, the remote bit warm, like even less so than what it would have taken to warp the rotors to begin with, they continue to get more and more warped. So they've gotten worse in the little bit of driving we've done with the truck, to the point where you can't really drive the truck that hard, because when you get in the brakes, it tries to shake the whole truck apart. So that's what we're doing today, is we're going to put new rotors and stuff on the front. And then we might, if I can dig up enough pieces to do a temporary stack install, we might end up putting the stack on the truck. Right now, the exhaust is just basically the downpipe. You know, obviously we'd like to get, you know, somewhat of a real exhaust on it. I was just trying to figure out where all the oil was coming from. It kind of looks to me like the new output shaft seal we put in is leaking. I definitely feel like we checked this too. The amount of distance here of being able for it, the drive shaft to go in and out of the tail housing, does actually get longer when the truck is on the ground. But we may have to put it on the 4-post and verify that this drive shaft's not too long. Because if that's leaking, there's a good possibility that when we're driving down the road, that this thing is just going in too far, and that's what's caused the seal to go out. But we'll deal with that later. For anyone that doesn't know, 2WD Superduties have a very similar suspension design to what would have been in like the old body style Fords and previous generations to that, of a twin I-beam style. This is a redesigned style, so it's not the same, but it's very, very similar. And so not only that, but they don't utilize a unit bearing for the wheel bearings. They utilize a just old style tapered roller bearing, you know, normal style bearing, which also means that the rotors are significantly more expensive than they really need to be, because you're buying a one-piece hub and rotor assembly. Sure that your seals are right before you start taking stuff apart. I verified they fit in the new hubs, but I wanted to verify that it was the right size for the spindle. So we were gonna try and do this the cheap way in hopes of, which cheap, it was like $33 for the bearings. I should have just ordered those to begin with, but we were gonna try and do this the cheap way and not replace the bearings, but I noticed when I was taking the spindle nut off that the spindle nut was really tight, and so my best guess is that whoever had this apart last time did not know what they were doing and way over tightened the spindle nut, which causes, you can see how the bearings are all brown. That's from heat. So this physically had a ton of heat put into this bearing, and then you guys aren't going to be able to see it on the camera, but the bearing has actually been skidding. So skidding means like it's turning, but the bearing isn't physically turning. It's just like skidding on the inner ring, and both of the bearings are kind of similar. The outer bearing isn't browned like the inner one. It's got a little bit of bluing here and there, but it's got some skidding marks on the bearings as well. So we just ordered new bearings, and we're waiting on them to show up. Suppose I wasted 2 cans of brake cleaner cleaning those for nothing, but whatever. But yeah, we're just waiting on those now, and then we'll continue on. For those of you that don't know, when you get new bearings, they come with a kind of like an anti-rust. I don't know if you guys can see that in the camera, but it's kind of a yellowy, consistency, color, like weird stuff. So whenever you get new bearings or new races, it's kind of the same thing like when you're doing brakes, like it comes with the same style of coating on it. You always take brake cleaner and clean the coating off. For people who don't know how to pack bearings, this is the old school way to do it. Take some grease, put it in the palm of your hand, and what you're trying to do is you're going to take the bearing and kind of, do that, against the grease until you get grease out of the front side of the bearing. So you just go through and do that all the way around, and that is what is called packing wheel bearings. They do make special tools to do this. That makes this immensely easier and a lot less messy. I don't do enough wheel bearing packing around here to justify purchasing one of those tools, but if you're doing it a lot, it's definitely worthwhile. But you just kind of go around until you got the bearing completely packed. So you can kind of see it's got grease all the way around coming through the outside. Then I usually just take the excess grease and kind of grease the bearing up all the way around, drop the bearing in. You can do it one of two ways. Really, probably the best way to do it is just go ahead and pack both the front and rear, so inner outer bearing at the same time. Obviously, you're going to want to put this bearing in and get the seal pressed in. And then you flip it over and you can get the other bearing and whatever. So if you have an air hose handy, you want to try and get as much of the brake cleaner out of the bearing as you can before you start packing it full of grease, because the brake cleaner will break down the grease after you put it in. This is a good one to show you because the gaps are a little bigger. You can see how it pushed the grease through between the roller bearings. If you've got kids, this is a great job to give them, because I know when I was a kid doing this type of stuff was so much fun because you got to play with the grease. You just want to make sure when you put the seal in that you get it in nice and flush. The that socket was a little on the small side for what we were doing, but you basically, whenever you're finding something to put the seal in with, you basically want to make sure that when you're pressing on this side or tapping on it or whatever, that whatever you're using is about the size of the main lip of the seal that actually goes into the hub. So you can see like that socket is, pretty much the size of that. So that way you're pressing. You don't want to be pressing on this outer lip out here because you just bend that lip. So then once you get, probably a smart idea to go ahead and clean the anti-rust coating off of the bearing races, off both of them before you put a bearing in. I mistakenly did not do that, so just do it with a little brake clean on a rag. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to take grease and you're going to want to kind of pack this whole intermediate section between the two bearings with grease. So basically what that's going to do is you're going to, when the grease heats up, it's going to push outward towards the bearings. So it'll keep grease, kind of, not necessarily keep feeding the grease into the bearings, but it'll kind of keep the grease pushing into the bearings. So you'll have grease in there, besides what you're, just what's in your bearings. So in the grease that I put in there is there's a little bit more grease in there than what, space will allow for. So when you put it in there, it'll kind of, the spindle will kind of push that grease around and make it kind of uniform to the spindle. You also want to make sure when you're putting the hub on that you don't nick the seal on the threads of the spindle. You can get as much of the old grease out of it as you can. I like to use these Nipex or Nipex or whatever you want to call them, mainly because they're not normal channel locks. So normal channel locks would just have a flat spot in them, but they have like a notch in them to fit around the nut nicely. And so you don't have to, you can just wipe these off, spray them off with brake clean, whatever, and you don't have to fill your sockets full of grease. And they won't, as long as you're smart with them, they won't, mess up the nut. Look at that. You can see how nicely that fits around the nut. That's kind of what you want to see. I don't know if she was able to catch that in the camera, but when I was tightening that down, all that extra grease that I put in the center, when I tightened it down, it actually pushed more grease through the bearing. So that's kind of what you want to see when you're putting it together. If you don't see a bunch come out, that's fine. If it moves at all, that's what you're looking for. You're not looking for, you know, a ton to come out between the bearing. But basically what you're going to do, if you have, and there's a million ways to do this. This is just my way of doing it. I've never had issues with it. I've done hundreds and hundreds of sets of, you know, like trailer wheel bearings and that type of thing. The way that I've always done it is so if you're reusing old bearings, what you're going to do is you're going to basically, you know, roll it, tighten it, roll it, tighten it, roll it, tighten it. And then once you get it to where you're basically zero, I would say zero lash, so you don't get any more tension out of it, you're going to loosen it and then just snug it. And then that's where you're going to leave it. With new bearings, you have to set them as a preload. So you're going to tighten and tighten and tighten. And you basically get it to a point where you're happy with the way that it rolls. I always loosen them a little bit. So then we're loosened back up, and then you're going to reset the bearings. So if you don't do this, they won't set in right, and then you end up with loose wheel bearings, basically, with new bearings, because new bearings have to set. So, and I'm sure there's probably a torque spec out there or something like that. This is just the way that I've always done it. Give me shit if you want to, I don't care. Always put a new cotter pin. Don't reuse your cotter pins. And clean your grease cap out too. Pack it full of some new grease. You don't want too much grease, because you need space in there for the grease to expand. So like in this instance, that was packed completely full of grease. So I'm going to take not as much grease and replace it. So I'm going to put, you know, say something like that, where it just has enough in there. And this may be completely unnecessary, but again, this is the way that I've always done it, so I'm going to continue doing it that way. Never put your brakes together without Loctite. The proper way to be doing this would be putting calipers on it, but we are going to chance it and just pad slap it and see what happens. So when you are reusing calipers, something you have to do is press the pistons back in the caliper. You probably aren't going to have one of these fancy tools, which just goes, in here like this. So, and then you hope that your parts don't fall apart, your things don't fall apart. But you can use a C-clamp, and you take one of your old pads and you set it against the pistons like that, like this, and then you can take a C-clamp and go like that, and then tighten in. You want to push those pistons in evenly. You don't want to push one at a time. So you take your old pad like that, put your C-clamp around there, and then tighten your C-clamp up, and that'll pull your pistons back in. Also, if you're going to reuse your calipers and your brackets, you probably want to make sure that your caliper slides are sliding nice and easy, which these ones aren't too bad. This bottom one's a little sticky, so we are going to clean that real quick. And then re-lube it. And then you can get this from O'Reilly's or Napa or whatever. It's obviously specific to brake stuff. It's high temp. That's the big thing. Get nice and lubed up there. I don't think that there's such a thing as too much grease on these. A little bit in there, so there's a little bit before you put the slide back in. Don't forget your dust boot, and shove that thing back in there. Make sure you get your boot back in its little grooves on both sides. This truck was a fleet truck prior to my ownership, so my feeling is that these calipers are probably the original calipers. So basically what I did here, again, this is not like, if this was any of our other trucks or a customer's truck or anything like that, I'd be putting new calipers on it. But because of what this is, I don't really care. But what I'm gonna do is, we'll see how these ones run out, and if we have any kind of an issue with them sticking or, you know, doing anything weird, then we will just go ahead and put new calipers on it. These pads were like, and I did that on purpose, is these pads were like the cheapest pads I could get from Napa. So in case we do run into an issue where we've got a sticky caliper, we're not wasting a set of, you know, $80 pads or, you know, anything like that, because more than likely I don't end up putting calipers on it, but it is what it is. Alrighty guys, that'll conclude our video for today. So, like I say, we got the brakes done, and then I didn't show you guys that in this video, but in last week's video, we just threw a quick exhaust together just to get the exhaust out from underneath the cab. It was pretty droney and resonating in the cab, which isn't that big of a deal, but it was starting to kind of eat at me that it was that way. So we just kind of threw together some pieces of exhaust just to kind of get it pointed out the side of the truck. I don't know why, but I had this issue on the last truck that I had this turbo kit on, but the downpipe fitment just isn't great, and it rubs on the firewall. When we come back to it to put the stack in, we'll see about doing something about that. Yeah, so anyway, so we'll kind of do something with that later. The calipers in the front, we may end up putting calipers on it. Again, this isn't a truck that really is, you know, going to get driven very many miles, very far from home, you know, type of thing. And so I'm not too worried about the calipers as far as, you know, having them, you know, if they stick, they stick. I'm not that far away from the shop, you know, that type of thing. So normally, like I say, if it were any of our other trucks or a customer's vehicle or anything, it would have gotten calipers. But just because of what the situation is, I just decided not to throw calipers at it. But next year, our plan is, and I think I've said this, our plan is next year to go to Rocky Mountain Race Week 1.0. And so prior to going on Rocky Mountain Race Week, we'll go ahead and throw calipers on it. There's a ton of stuff that we're going to do prior to going on Rocky Mountain Race Week. So, like I say, calipers will be one of those things. And yeah, so anyways, guys, that's it. If you guys like the videos, please subscribe. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one.